Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th, but it invaded the United States decades before. Join us. Khaled Abu Toameh, we're going to talk about terror financing today, but expand the whole concept of crypto financing of the Hamas, Hawala financing of the Hamas. We're going to talk about Hamas terror financing in America that began in the 1990s when the Holy Land Foundation was receiving millions of dollars for Hamas directly in the Gaza Strip, actually, and it started even in the early 90s, about 5 years after Hamas was founded. Holy Land Foundation shut down, basically, after 2001, $12.4 million going to Musa Abu Marzouk from the United States to Hamas and other Hamas-affiliated NGOs in America. This is something that is really not known in the public discourse and even in the political discourse on Hamas. Hamas invaded the United States years ago with terror financing.
Absolutely, and it's not new, Dan. We need to look at the sources. I mean, where did the financing come from? Hamas did not have back then, 30 years ago or 25 years ago, its own sources of income. Hamas was being funded by who? By two major parties, Qatar and Iran. Qatar, we all know, has always been the sponsor of Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas is an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood. So most of the cash came from Qatar and later also from Iran. Iran's money went to building the military capabilities of Hamas. Qatar's money went to strengthening both the political and military wings of Hamas. And of course, that also reached the university campuses and other places in the U.S. So if you fund Hamas in Gaza and if you fund Hamas in Doha, you're actually funding Hamas also in the U.S.
Well, I think that's the key point, Khaled, because we know the university system in the United States has been funded by Qatar to the tunes of billions of dollars. And I'm talking about research that was done at the JCPA, but also specifically by Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, FDD, and ISGAP, run by Professor Charles Small. They've done some tremendous work, especially both FDD and ISGAP have done tremendous work on Qatar's terror financing of universities. When I say terror financing, I mean soft terror, meaning what you might call dawah or influence.
Money going to Middle East departments, money going to other departments and campuses at universities, very influential universities.
Northwestern, Georgetown, Carnegie Mellon University, many other campuses having branches in Doha. And we know that documented and undocumented, $5 billion in the last 7 or 8 years alone. And according to ISGAP's founder, CEO, and director, Professor Charles Small, Qatar has donated through companies it owns, corporations it invests in, associations and organizations as well, tens of billions of dollars in the last 20 years alone.
And when we say Qatar, that's Muslim Brotherhood.
And that's Hamas. So
and Hamas is an offshoot, as I mentioned earlier,
for sure,
as I said, of Muslim Brotherhood. And by the way, if you look at some of the Arab countries, they know this, and they already sanctioned Qatar in 2017 for its support for the Muslim Brotherhood and for Hamas. If you remember, Dan, in 2017, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and I can't remember one more country, they cut off their diplomatic ties with Qatar, citing Qatar's support for terrorism and Muslim Brotherhood. And in different statements we saw back then, they were talking about how Qatar finances Islamist groups throughout the Arab world. So the Arabs were trying to prevent that at an earlier stage. Some of them have been successful, others have not been successful. In 2018, the Saudis cracked down on Hamas for collecting donations in Saudi Arabia. They arrested more than 62 leaders and activists of Hamas in Saudi Arabia. It was all because of money. And from the reports that we saw back then, most of the money was coming from groups linked to Qatar, not necessarily directly from Qatar.
Because those are NGOs, and those are non-government organizations. Some of them are 501c3s. We know, for example, that the Westpac, the NGO in White Plains, New York, has been a clearinghouse for very, very strange funding of some of these groups. Some of them related to Qatar, others of them related to other sources of Middle Eastern financing. There is at least $13 billion from Middle Eastern countries going into the North American university system.
Now, note, Dan, that in the Middle East, there's a new phenomena that I've noticed. In addition to Al Jazeera, which has always been the mouthpiece of Qatar, in recent years, several media outlets affiliated with Qatar, directly and indirectly, have popped up. They've emerged on social media. Some of them are pretending to be, neutral, objective media outlets, but they are also advancing the agenda of Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood. So Qatar is also using money to control the media with the hope of controlling the narrative, and of course spreading its agenda and its plans. They had been doing it so far through Al Jazeera for many, many years, but now they're expanding it, and this is something we need to take note of, because a lot of money is going into these media outlets. They're pouring, you can see it, millions and millions of dollars on journalists, newspaper editors to join in promoting the narrative of the Qataris, or the propaganda of Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas, of course.
Let's be very clear for our viewers about what the Muslim Brotherhood doctrine really means, because many people are unaware of what the school of thought is, the doctrine. And it's very important that they understand, because people understand Hamas equals violence, rape, murder, especially after October 7th, and kidnapping. But the Muslim Brotherhood the Muslim Brotherhood actually was really uncovered en masse by Swiss intelligence some 40 years ago, when Sami Arian, Professor Sami Arian in Florida State University, was there, and their doctrine holds for the destruction of America and destruction of the Jews, killing of Jews through subversion, using political Islam and the trappings and the doctrine, the language, the rhetoric of the West in order to undermine the West. It's very important that people understand what that is and how dangerous it is.
And then the irony is that Hamas, in 2017 or shortly before that, in an attempt to beautify its image in the West, they announced that they are distancing themselves from the Muslim Brotherhood, which means that even Hamas acknowledges that the Muslim Brotherhood doctrine is much more radical, or too radical to be accepted by the West. And that was an attempt we saw back then by Hamas, saying, oh no, we are no longer associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Yes, we were an offshoot of them, but this just shows you how dangerous the Muslim Brotherhood doctrine is, the ideology is. And it's no wonder that Muslim Brotherhood is banned in several Arab countries. It's also outlawed.
Egypt, it's outlawed right in Egypt. It's outlawed in Saudi. It's outlawed in Saudi Arabia. Jordan, no, actually, because Hamas has actually militarized itself in Jordan, but the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan was an acceptable political party, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
right?
And they were part of the parliament, and they're still accepted over there, I would say.
But in Bahrain, for example, Muslim Brotherhood is also banned. Khaled, the chief theologian of the Muslim Brotherhood was the very well-known Yosef al-Qaradawi. And
who was living in
He was living in Doha. He
In
died
Doha.
in Doha, but before that, he was living in Egypt.
Yes.
He was an Egyptian cleric and moved to Doha. So he was a Qatari base. There you have it. Qatari base, that Muslim Brotherhood Hamas Qatari connection.
And from Doha, he was issuing the fatwas, allowing suicide bombings, delegitimizing Israel, demonizing Jews. He had a number of very problematic fatwas, and he was the godfather of the Muslim Brotherhood, the main ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the spiritual leader, the real spiritual leader of Hamas, by the way. So
more than Sheikh Ahmad Yassin.
Well, Sheikh Ahmad Yassin was, but he didn't live for too long. But Sheikh Qaradawi was and remains the Pope of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, organization around the Arab and Muslim world.
And let's remember what Yosef al-Qaradawi said about the United States. The United States should be destroyed, he said. And number two, and people can look this up on Google, he said that Hitler punished the Jews for their misbehavior. So he was...
And this is a spiritual leader who is sitting in a country where you have the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East.
And all of these universities. He really became sort of the academic figurehead, funny enough, for the theological academic figurehead in what was called the Education Center in Doha, where these major universities like Northwestern and Georgetown and others were based.
The Qataris were hoping to use Sheikh Qaradawi to replace the Al-Azhar University, the largest
in Cairo,
the largest Islamic institution in the Arab world, an authority.
Right.
But it didn't really work. But he was, there was an attempt by the Qataris to create an alternative to Al-Azhar, which is much more radical than Al-Azhar. The Qataris considered Al-Azhar to be too moderate and too affiliated with the secular regime in Egypt, and that's why they embraced Sheikh Qaradawi and allowed him to distribute money, to try to influence as many scholars in the Arab and Muslim world as possible, with the hope of creating a new Islamic authority or institution that would serve as a point of reference to Muslims, that would be responsible for fatwas, that would be, that all the Islamists would be inspired by it.
Absolutely. And Khaled, people wonder why, since October the 7th, across North American campuses, and I'm talking about more than 100, 150, even 200 American campuses, on which Students for Justice in Palestine is situated as the leading, what they call pro-Palestinian group. It's not pro-Palestinian at all. It's completely
about hating Israel.
It's about destroying Israel. It's about destroy. They say it themselves. I mean, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. A clarion call for the mass murder of Jews. That is, and a lot of that is funded through the undocumented funding by Qatar. People wonder, where does all these hundreds of millions and billions of dollars go, and how do they fund the Students for Justice in Palestine? Well, the answer is in part in Doha, and a lot of these hidden, secreted contributions that are made through all courts, all sorts of ways that end up reaching these student organizations and creating the worst mass hatred, violent Jew hatred organizations that we have seen in the West since the Nazi period.
It's true, Dan, and the question is, what are the Americans doing about it? This is a question that needs to be asked to Congress, to senator members, and other people, members of the Senate, and other people in the U.S.
Congress, the big issue, of course, is the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which is the protection of freedom of speech. But and there's really a question that has come up in the political discourse, the academic discourse. Are there limits to freedom of speech the way there are in Europe and, by the way, in Israel following the Nazi period and the Holocaust, which is to say, when does free speech become incitement to murder? And in that case, it is no longer protected speech. And there's a real issue following the simply astounding and intolerable presentation, the question-answer session in front of Congress by the presidents of Harvard, of Penn, and MIT. They were unable and unwilling to either define or or operationalize their codes of conduct to say that calls for genocide against Jews on campuses is not protected speech and is not aligned and accepted by codes of conduct of those universities. That's the danger point that we've reached right now.
And this is the same Arab country that is hosting the Hamas leaders until today. Most of the political leaders of Hamas, from Khaled Mash'al, Ismail Haniyeh, Khalil al-Hayya, Tahir al-Nunu, they are all sitting in Doha.
At the Four Seasons Hotel.
I'm not sure if it's there or somewhere else. I think at one stage they were staying in the hotel, but each one of them has his own villa, his own bodyguards. Someone is paying for this. Where's all this money coming
from? Well, Haniyeh himself is worth a couple $1 billion, as Khaled Mash'al is worth over $1 billion.
So when Qatar pours all this money in the U.S. and in other places, it's to help these Hamas people spread their message. It's to help the Muslim Brotherhood spread their message, the same way that Al Jazeera in Arabic is also serving as a platform for spreading these messages. And you know what? The Qataris don't even hide it, by the way. They don't hide it. You see it.
Yeah.
Through their broadcast, you see that Al Jazeera, since even before that, by the way, before October 7, has been serving as a mouthpiece for Hamas.
And Osama bin Laden, by the way. They have been, until the day he died.
It reminds me, Dan, when Hamas won the election, and the parliamentary election in 2006, I was interviewing Palestinian Authority officials in Ramallah, and many of them blamed Al Jazeera for the Hamas victory. They said, Al Jazeera was promoting Hamas, and Al Jazeera was helping Hamas, and they did not hide it, to a point where the Palestinian Authority at one point was considering closing down the Al Jazeera offices in Ramallah because they considered them to be too dangerous. And there was a point, I can't remember which year, where Fatah activists in Ramallah attacked the Al Jazeera offices and vehicles in Ramallah, accusing them of serving as a mouthpiece for Hamas.
It's extraordinary. When you look at Qatar's multi-billion-dollar influence operation on U.S. universities, and you track them and trace them back to what you're talking about, to Doha, which some people call a bank with a flag, as opposed to a normalized state, which, by the way, has a lot of influence over the United States. You see, America has a major military base there and investments there and so on. So that it gives the Qataris have a lot of leverage over what's happening. Having said that, there are two other major forms of terror financing that have flooded into the United States that many people are unaware of, and one is the NGOs surrounding the BDS National Committee, which some people forget was founded in Ramallah. Back in 2007, it was established, and that came just a few years after the Durban conference, the UN-sanctioned Durban conference against racism in Durban, South Africa. Now, all of the Qatari financial activity, the BDS movement, and Students for Justice in Palestine began to pick up an awful lot of steam across North America after 2001. So between 2001 and 2010, you saw this explosion of Israel hatred, Jew hatred activity across U.S. campuses, well funded by the BDS National Committee, which, by the way, the Boycott National Committee in Ramallah included, as of 2000, what it includes, something called the PNIF, the Palestinian National Islamic Forces, which is the umbrella organization of terror groups, including Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, founded by whom? Marwan Barghouti, who today is being fronted or platformed as a potential successor to Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO.
And Dan, this is the same Qatar that is now acting as a mediator, as a fair, unbiased mediator between Israel and Hamas.
A fair broker, they call it, right? A broker.
Qatar is not a broker. Qatar is Hamas. Qatar is Muslim Brotherhood. And if Qatar really wanted, by the way, to get the hostages released, the Israeli hostages released, all they have to do is summon Khaled Mashal, Ismail Haniya, and a number of Hamas leaders to the palace of the emir and tell them you have 24 hours to release the hostages and end the war in Gaza.
Why didn't that happen, Khaled? I fail to wrap my head around that position in such a situation where women and girls were and continued, I believe, to be raped and sexually abused. Children, the Bibas family continued, they even fear for their lives, as we saw reported on Israeli media just yesterday and the day before, and all of these other horrible the situation for kidnapped victims, 134 kidnapped victims still in Hamas hands. How is it that the Qataris didn't do what you just said a minute ago, 24 hours?
I think there are two reasons. One is they don't feel enough pressure coming from Americans, from the international community, so they're not going to do it. And number two, I think the Qataris want guarantees that Hamas will remain in power. They will start putting pressure on Hamas only when they receive assurances that Hamas will continue to control Gaza. That's their main goal right now.
Because they want a leverage point in Gaza?
Yes, they want to, as long as Hamas is over there, that means Qatar is over there, that means Muslim Brotherhood is over there. And this is something that Qatar is afraid of losing. So that's why it's very important.
They haven't gotten the guarantee, not from Israel for sure, not from the United States.
So they say, let it continue and until these Israelis, are too tired, and they will eventually surrender and give up to the demands of Hamas. But they're not going to do anything as long as they don't receive guarantees that Hamas will remain in power, and as long as there isn't enough pressure on them from the Americans, from the Europeans, and from other countries.
So then we go back from Gaza back to America, and we talked in the beginning of the program 20 minutes ago where we started about Hamas terror financing in the 90s and in 2000. So what happened was, and here's a big an anchor point to our conversation, in 2005, there was an organization founded called American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, and that organization was founded by Dr. Hatem Bazian, who was a professor at Berkeley University, who founded the Students for Justice in Palestine all the way back in 1992, and he was an unindicted conspirator of the HLF case, the Holy Land Foundation case, the most highly prosecuted terror financing case in American history, by the way, which we mentioned at the beginning of the show. There were a number of conspirators that were not indicted. Others fled. And today, believe it or not, AMP today in 2024 is being run by some of those fundraisers and executives of Holy Land Foundation case that were not indicted and, of course, not convicted nor indicted. And they're today running this AMP, which was founded in 2005, which is one of the main funding channels for SJP, Students of Justice for Palestine, which has really kidnapped up to 200 campuses across the United States. These are the organizations that are fueling from the river to the sea Palestine.
The so-called pro-Palestinian groups.
The so-called pro-Palestinian groups.
I'm dying to find out what have they done to help the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
Have they channeled some of these funds to boost employment in the West Bank, to boost the Palestinian economy, or to help the poor people in Gaza?
High-tech startups, maybe?
Yeah. What have they created? Have they established industrial zones? What have they done? So we're sitting here and talking about billions and billions of dollars. Can you imagine if some of this money went to help the Palestinian people instead of giving it to so-called pro-Palestinian groups whose only goal is to incite against Israel?
Correct.
So I don't see, what are they doing to help the Palestinian people?
If the Palestinian public would start an NGO that would actually call out and expose these cynical, well-funded groups in America who all they want to do is self-perpetuate and spread hatred, violence across American campuses, that is basically their directed goal, has nothing to do with actually helping the Palestinian people or the issue of resolving whatever political, and other conflict there are between the Palestinians among themselves and with Israel. They have no intention of doing that.
Hamas has been ruling the Gaza Strip since 2007. What have these organizations based in the U.S., in Europe, what have they done to promote the rights of women living under Hamas?
Other minorities, Christians and other minorities too.
What have they done to help the Christians whose number dropped since 2007 from 3,000 to 600 or 500 today? What have they done to defend the rights of the gay people living under Hamas? What have they done to help journalists and human rights activists who were targeted by Hamas? Nothing. So they are not entitled to call themselves pro-Palestinian. Sitting in the U.S. and spewing hatred against Israel does not make you pro-Palestinian. You are only Israel haters.
Absolutely. And in fact, there's a third sleeve of terror financing in the United States, and that is, believe it or not, the universities themselves. Why? Because Students for Justice in Palestine, the Palestine Solidarity Committee, if not now, and some of these other, even something called the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is really PIECE, not PEACE. These completely misguided, ill-advised, completely, as they say, off the page people who are supporting the Hamas since 2007, are doing it with the support of and sanction of the universities themselves. Why? Because SJP in many universities, not in all, and recently there have been some reversals, but I'll talk about that in a second. But in many universities, the majority of them, they're a legitimate student organization. They don't have to be a 501. They don't need to report because they're not a 501c3. They're simply a recognized student organization. I know that Harvard University in 2019 provided $2,050 for the Israel Apartheid Week hatred festival, and this goes on other universities. So in a way, you can argue that some of America's best liberal arts universities in the Ivy League, whether it could Yale, Harvard, Cornell, Penn, and others supporting SJP, are actually terror financiers by extension.
Yeah, these are just campaigns to vilify Israel and demonize Jews. And this is where the money is going to. And it will affect not only Jews in Israel, it will affect also Jews worldwide, including in the U.S. And that's why people need to wake up and start looking at these serious things that are happening on the campuses and elsewhere in the U.S. This Qatari-funded campaign or machinery is promoting hatred. It's promoting violence. It's promoting radical Islam. And this is not something good, not for the region and not for what's happening in the U.S.
As a matter of fact, I think we could probably call this show Follow the Money, otherwise the terror will follow you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why people need to wake up.
I think you said it very well. That will put the period at the end of your last statement, an exclamation point. And thank you ever so much, Khaled Abu Toameh, my dear friend and colleague for almost 3 decades. And this is Al-Shaq Al-Awsat Lana, Our Middle East, which is, we're trying to really understand the Middle East from the inside out and really bring the real story happening behind the scenes in the Middle East and above the radar in the Middle East. And now it is really spreading to North America. And some of our friends recognize that what we talked about today is not only a national security threat to Israel and to the Jewish people, it's actually a security threat to the peoples of the Middle East and of North America and the free world.
True.
Absolutely. Khaled Abu Toameh, thank you ever so much. It's great to see you.